Hey everyone, welcome back to the Shivering Mouse. I'm so excited to have you back here today. Today we are back in our outdoor Shivering Mouse facility, so there might be a little bit of glare, but I do want you to try and focus on the story instead. I just wanted to enjoy some of the wonderful sunshine while it's still gorgeous outside. So today we are going to read Chapter 12 of The Last Battle, part of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, and today's chapter is Through the Stable Door, which is somewhere so far that we have not wanted to go in the series, so it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Jill ought to have been back at the White Rock already, but she had quite forgotten that part of her orders in the excitement of watching the fight. Now she remembered. She turned at once and ran to it, and arrived there barely a second before the others. It thus happened that all of them, for a moment, had their backs to the enemy. They all wheeled around the moment they reached it, and a terrible sight met their eyes. A collarman was running towards the stable door, carrying something that kicked and struggled. As he came between them and the fire, they could clearly see the shape of the man and the shape of what he carried. It was Eustace. Tyrion and the unicorn rushed out to rescue him, but the collarman was now far nearer to the door than they. Before they had covered half of the distance, he had flung Eustace in and shut the door on him. Half a dozen more collarmans had run up behind him. They formed a line on the open space before the stable. There was no getting at it now. Even then Jill remembered to keep her face turned aside, well away from her bow. "Even if I can't stop from blubbing, I won't get my string wet," she said. "Where are arrows?" said Poggin suddenly. Everyone ducked and pulled his helmet well over his nose. The dogs crouched behind, but though a few arrows came their way, it soon became clear that they were not being shot at. Griffel and his dwarves were at their archery again. This time they were coolly shooting at the collarmans. "Keep it up, boys," came Griffel's voice. "Keep it together, carefully. We don't want any collarmans any more than we want monkeys or lions or kings. The dwarves are for the dwarves." Whatever else you may say about dwarves, no one can say that they aren't brave. They could easily have gotten away to some safe place. They preferred to stay and kill as many of both sides as they could, except when both sides were kind enough to save them the trouble by killing one another. They wanted Narnia for their own. What perhaps they had not taken into account was that the collarmans were mail-clad and the horses had had no protection. So the collarmans had a leader, Rishta Tarkin, and his voice cried out, "30 of you, keep watch over those fools by the White Rock. The rest after me, that we may teach these sons of earth a lesson." Ooh, that's not good. Tyrion and his friends, still panting from their fight and thankful for a few minutes' rest, stood and looked on while the Tarkin led his men against the dwarves. It was a strange scene by now. The fire had sunk lower, and the light gave it now less of a darker red. As far as one could see, the whole place of assembly was now empty except for the dwarves and the collarmans. In that light one couldn't make out much of what was happening. It sounded as if the dwarves were putting up a good fight. Tyrion could hear Griffel using dreadful language, and every now and then the Tarkin calling, "Take all you can alive! Take them alive!" Whatever that fight may have been like, it did not last long. The sounds of it died away. Then Jill saw the Tarkin coming back to the stable. 11 men followed him, dragging 11 bound dwarves. Whether the others had all been killed, or whether some of them had not gotten away, was never known. "Throw them into the shrine of Tash," said Rishta Tarkin, and when the 11 dwarves, one after another, had been flung in or kicked into the dark doorway, and the door had been shut again, he bowed low to the stable and said, "These are also for my burnt offering, Lord Tash." And all the collarmans banged the flats of their swords on their shields and shouted, "Tash! Tash! The great god Tash! Inexorable Tash!" There was no nonsense about any Tashland now. The little party by the White Rock watched these doings and whispered to one another. They had found a trickle of water coming down the rock, and all drank eagerly, Jill and Poggin and the king in their hands, while the 4-footed ones lapped up the little pool which it had made at the foot of the stone. Such was their thirst that it seemed to be the most delicious drink they had ever had in their lives, and while they were drinking they were perfectly happy, and they could not think of anything else. "I feel in my bones," said Poggin, "that we shall all, one by one, pass through that dark door by morning. I can think of 100 deaths I would rather have died." "It is indeed a grim door," said Tyrion. "It is more like a mouth." "Oh, can't we do anything to stop it?" said Jill in a shaken voice. "Nay, fair friend," said Jill, nosing her gently. "It may be for us the door to Aslan's country, and we shall sup at his table tonight." Rishta Tarkin turned his back on the stable and walked slowly to a place in front of the White Rock. "Hearken," he said, "if the boar and the dogs and the unicorns will come over to me and put themselves in my mercy, their lives shall be spared. The boar shall go into a cage in the Tisrock's garden, the dogs to the Tisrock's kennels, and the unicorn, when I have sawn off its horn, shall draw a cart, but the eagle, the children, and he who was the king shall be offered to Tash this night." Their answer was only growls. "Get on, warriors," said the Tarkan. "Kill the beasts, but take the two-legged ones alive." And then the last battle of the last king of Narnia began. What made it hopeless, even apart from the numbers of the enemy, was the spears. The Collarmans, who had been with the ape almost from the beginning, had had no spears, but that was because they had come into Narnia by ones and twos, pretending to be peaceful merchants, and of course they had carried no spears, for a spear is not a thing you can hide. The new ones must have come in later, after the ape was already strong, and they could march openly. The spears made all the difference. With a long spear you can kill a boar before you're in reach of his tusks, and a unicorn before you're in reach of its horn, if you're very quick and keep your head. And now they leveled spears, closing in on Tirian and his last friends. Next moment they were all fighting for their lives. In a way, it wasn't quite as bad as you would think. When you're using every muscle to the full, ducking under a spear point here, leaping over it there, lunging forward, drawing back, and wheeling round, you haven't much time to feel either frightened or sad. Tirian knew he could do nothing for the others now. They were all doomed together. He vaguely saw the boar go down on one side of him, Jewel fighting furiously on the other. Out of the corner of one eye he saw, but only just saw, a big collarman pulling Jill away somewhere by her hair. But he hardly thought about any of these things. His only thought now was to sell his life as dearly as he could. The worst of it was that he couldn't keep the position in which he had started, under the White Rock. A man who was fighting a dozen enemies at once must take his chances wherever he can. Must dart in wherever he sees an enemy's breast or neck, unguarded. In a very few strokes this might get you quite a distance from the spot where you began. Tirian soon found that he was getting further and further to the right, nearer to the stable. He had a vague idea in his mind that there was some good reason for keeping away from it, but he couldn't now remember what that reason was, and anyway, he couldn't help it. All at once, everything came quite clear. He found he was fighting the Tarkan himself. The bonfire, what was left of it, was straight in front, and he was, in fact, fighting in the very doorway of the stable, for it had been opened and two collarmans were holding the door, ready to slam it shut the moment he was inside. He remembered everything now, and he realized that the enemy had been edging him to the stable on purpose ever since the fight began, and while he was thinking this, he was still fighting the Tarkan as hard as he could. A new idea came into Tirian's head. He dropped his sword and darted forward under the sweep of the Tarkan scimitar and seized his enemy by the belt with both hands and jumped back into the stable, shouting, "Come in and meet your Tash yourself." There was a deafening noise, and as the ape had been flung into and the earth shook, there had been a blinding light. The collarman soldiers outside screamed, "Tash! Tash!" and banged the door. If Tash wanted their own captain, Tash must have him. They, at any rate, did not want to meet Tash. For a moment or two, Tirian did not know where he was or even who he was. Then he steadied himself, blinked, and looked around. It was not dark inside the stable, as he had expected. He was in strong light, and that was why he was blinking. He turned to look at Rishta Tarkan, but Rishta was not looking at him. Rishta gave a great wail and pointed. Then he put his hands before his face and fell flat face downwards on the ground. Tirian looked in the direction where the Tarkan had pointed, and then he understood. A terrible figure was coming towards them. It was far smaller than the shape they had seen from the tower, though still much bigger than a man. And it was the same. It was a vulture's head on 4 arms. Its beak was open, and its eyes blazed. A croaking noise came from its beak. "Thou hast called me into Narnia, Rishta Tarkan. Here I am. What hast thou to say?" But the Tarkan neither lifted his face from the ground nor said a word. He was shaking like a man with a bad hiccup. He was brave enough in battle, but half of his courage had left him earlier in that night when he first began to suspect that there might be a real Tash. The rest of it left him now. With a sudden jerk, like a hen stooping to pick up a worm, Tash pounced on the miserable Rishta and tucked him under the upper of his 2 right arms. Then Tash turned his head sideways to fix Tirian with one of his terrible eyes, for, of course, having a bird's head, he couldn't look at him straight. But immediately, from behind Tash, strong and calm as the summer sea, a voice said, "Begone, monster, and take your lawful prey to your own place, in the name of Aslan and Aslan's great father, the Emperor over the sea." The hideous creature vanished with the Tarkan still under its arm, and Tyrion turned to see who had spoken, and what he saw set his heart beating as fast as it has ever beaten in any fight. 7 kings and queens stood before him, all with crowns on their heads and all in glittering clothes, but the kings wore fine mail as well and had their swords drawn in their hands. Tyrion bowed courteously and was about to speak when the youngest of the queens laughed. He stared hard at her face, then gasped with amazement, for he knew her. It was Jill, but not Jill as he had last seen her, with her face all dirt and tears and an old drill dress half slipping off one shoulder. Now she looked cool and fresh as if she'd just come from bathing. And at first he thought she looked older, but then didn't. He could never make up his mind on that point. And then he saw that the youngest of the kings was Eustace, but he had also changed, as Jill had changed. And Tyrion felt suddenly awkward about coming among these people with blood and dust and sweat of battle still on him. The next moment he realized that he was not in that state at all. He was fresh and cool and clean and dressed in such clothes as he would have worn for a great feast at Cair Paravel, but in Narnia your good clothes are never your uncomfortable ones. They knew how to make things that felt beautiful as well as looking beautiful in Narnia, and there was no such thing as starch or flannel or elastic to be found from one end of the country to the other. "Sire," said Jill, coming forward and making a beautiful curtsy, "let me make you known to Peter, the High King over all kings in Narnia." Tyrion had no need to ask which was the High King, for he remembered his face, though it was far nobler from his dream. He stepped forward and sank on one knee and kissed Peter's hand. "High King, you are welcome to me," he said. The High King raised him and kissed him on both cheeks as High Kings should, then led him to the eldest queen, but even she was not old, for there were no gray hairs on her head, no wrinkles on her cheek, and said, "Sir, this is the Lady Polly, who came into Narnia on the first day when Aslan made the trees grow and the beasts talk." He brought him next to a man whose golden beard flowed over his face and chest, and whose face was full of wisdom. "And this," he said, "is the Lord Diggory, who was with her on that day, and this is my brother, King Edmund, and my sister, Queen Lucy." "Sire," said Tyrion, when he had greeted all of these, "if I have read your chronicles aright, there should be another. Has not your Majesty 2 sisters? Where's the Queen Susan?" "My sister Susan," said Peter shortly and gravely, "is no longer a friend of Narnia." "Yes," said Eustace, "and whenever you've tried to get her to come and talk about Narnia or do anything about Narnia, she says, 'What wonderful memories you have! Fancy, you're still thinking about all those funny games we used to play when we were children.'" "Oh, Susan," said Jill, "she's interested in nothing nowadays except nylons and lipstick and invitations. She always was a jolly sight too keen to be a grown-up." "Grown-up, indeed," said Lady Polly. "I wish she would grow up. She wasted all her school time wanting to be the age she is now, and she'll waste all the rest of her life trying to stay that age. Her whole idea is to race on to the silliest time in one's life as quick as she can, and then to stop there as long as she can." "Well, don't let's talk about that now," said Peter. "Look, here are the lovely fruit trees. Let's taste them." And then, for the first time, Tyrion looked around him and realized how very strange this adventure was. The next chapter is going to be chapter 13, How the Dwarves Refused to be Taken In. Thank you for tuning in with me today.